So Eric, with looking back at this, like, what are your thoughts? Like 20 some years later.
I was so young once upon
I
a time. That's
know.
the crazy thing. And I only had red shirts.
Now I
that's,
only have red
that's my
shirts.
major response. No, it's amazing. I mean, first of all, uh, before we get into it, can I just say thank you to Judith and Fennell and the team at Cartemquin for making this amazing films. You know, so it's not exactly about the issue, but when you know, write a book and then someone tells you they want to turn it into a film, it's very exciting. It's also, very scary because, you put a lot of your heart and soul into a book like this one, and you don't know where the story is going to end up. And as you all know from watching that film, Judith has a voice, and I trusted Judith from the day I met her to do something brilliant and different, and to take the story to some different places. And it really is just a kind of thrill to see it come to life. And also, it takes so many people to make a movie. That's also kind of just like writing a book is a somewhat solitary affair, and just watching the credits was amazing. So, So one thing I think about is kind of there. I guess there's two journeys that I've seen since the book came out, and the first is that when I started working on the book, which was my dissertation in graduate school, I started thinking about it in the late summer of 1995 because I had been living in Europe and I was about to start graduate school in sociology, and I got home to Chicago. I grew up here, and I had these very weird conversations with people about the heat wave, which I had read about. And I always remember this. Like, on the one hand, everybody remembered that kind of spectacular and bizarre scene of the meatpacking trucks, the refrigerated meat trucks at the morgue. But also, all these people kept saying, well, I'm not really sure that the heat wave was really real. I wasn't sure the disaster was really real. That was this phrase. And honestly, it felt so powerful and strange to me that I was coming back home and everybody remembered the thing on the one hand, but they are also in incredible denial. And that for me was this kind of amazing metaphor for what it was like to grow up on the north side of Chicago, which was like, here's a city that's completely organized around racial segregation and racial discrimination. And it just was daily life. It kind of was unremarked upon, even though it kind of organized your life in so many ways, from my perspective, down to like, don't go to this neighborhood, don't cross this street, don't go to this school. There's a story I tell in the recent book that I wrote about growing up in Old Town, and there was a basketball court on what's now LaSalle School, which is kind of at the border between Old Town and Cabrini and the kind of the old Cabrini Green. And I always remember that I loved to play basketball, and it was like one of the few places in Old Town where there were a lot of African Americans who came. And there was one day when the hoops came down, not the nets, the hoops came down, like the actual rims came down, and I was so upset about that. And then the city came, put them back up, and then like a couple days later, the hoops came down again. And I remember because like I grew up a white kid in Chicago, and I was trained to kind of think like, be careful if you're around black people because something bad could happen. Not necessarily by my parents, but that's kind of the message you get when you're a white person growing up in Chicago on the north side. And I was so upset, and I remember going to this friend's house and saying like, I can't believe, these basketball hoops kept coming down. Who do you think? Do you think kids from Cabrini Green took them down? And I remember this kid said to me, no, 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 no. My brother took them down because he didn't want black people coming into Old Town anymore. And that was just like this incredible revelation about Chicago. And that was part of the response to the heat wave. Like, on the one hand, we know, on the other hand, we're part of it. On the other hand, we don't talk about it. And so the first journey is that on the one, when this project started, the heat wave was a non-event, and it's not a non-event anymore. And the other thing that started that's changed is that when I wrote the book, we didn't talk about climate change. In fact, like, there's very little about global warming and climate change in the book, which was written in the late 1990s and came out in the early 2000s. And now, I mean, we should note that today it was 108.6 degrees in Paris. It's the hottest day in the recorded history of much of Europe. And there's not a single person in this room who thinks that that record is going to last very long. And so the other thing that's happened is that this weather that seemed kind of anomalous and freakish in the book, when I worked on this, and the book was like, it's about the everyday social conditions, it's about the everyday inequality, it's not about the heat. And I stand by that. Like the story of the heat wave in Chicago is a story about racial inequality and about inequality and the health consequences of that. But also, it's ever more about the heat, because now we have this kind of smashing together of cities that are organized around racial inequality and the most dangerous weather that we've ever witnessed as a species. And that's the situation that we're barreling towards right now.
So, would you say, looking back at Richard Daley and how he handled the situation, would you say that was it racism that caused that blind spot for him, or was it other factors involved?
I mean, I can't say, precisely what caused Daley's response to it. I mean, is there a legacy of racism in the Daley family that has made Chicago more segregated and unequal than it might otherwise have been?
Maybe.
It's like,
Possibly.
I mean, the city is structured around what was clearly racism from his father, right? Because like the location of the housing projects and the highways that divided the housing projects from white communities, like that happened all over the city. The white neighborhoods that wouldn't take public housing in and that were sanctioned and approved by the power structure of Chicago, that's like a part of our story. I mean, so that's an extreme thing in Chicago, and the segregation in Chicago is extreme, and it was not in any way the case that Mayor Daley, the second, Richard M. Daley, when he came in, kind of corrected all of that. We're far from it. And in that, Chicago is very much like many other cities in the United States. So do I think it was racism? I mean, there was racism for sure, but it's deeper than that, because it was about the refusal, I think, to recognize the way in which race is structured inequality in the city on a daily basis, and that was part of the Daley legacy. But frankly, here we are in Chicago. It's kind of on all of us, and that was you showed in the film the image of that newscaster saying, with who's to blame in the background, and there's a section in the book that talks about this, because the response to a crisis like a heat wave is to point the finger of blame, right? And I think it's very tempting to say that what happened in Chicago in 1995 is that Mayor Daley was racist, But the truth I think is much more difficult for us all to deal with is that, we collectively live in a city whose structure is racist. And I think we accept this as a kind of order of things. Not everyone, obviously, and we're in a different place, and there are incredible things happening. And I love ending with Growing Home and the community garden movement. And there's a kind of amazing energy to change things that you see in many parts of Chicago. But at the same time, we are collectively part of a city which is, on the one hand, magnificent. I came home last night. The fireworks were out last night, and the skyline looked beautiful. Is there anybody in this room who has not walked on our lakefront and marveled at the fact that, this is the best, most beautiful, amazing city? I mean, you can't, even if you live in a really tough neighborhood in Chicago, there's certain moments when you see it and it's great. And we feel this kind of parochial attachment to it. But at the same time, there's something that's deeply wrong and horrible about Chicago. And for me, what was so powerful about the heat wave, and the fact that people in Chicago thought it wasn't really real, even though they knew what happened, and that no one else paid attention. It was a non-event. The Chicago heat wave of 1995 was a non-event. Is that perfectly expresses, I think, this fact about Chicago life. And I couldn't believe that no one had told that story when I came upon it. And I had to tell the story, like that when you have that image of me going into the boxes. There are archives in Chicago, and people thought I was a complete freak. I would like knock on the doors and call these city agencies and county agencies asking if anyone had the records of people's personal effects that the city discovered because no one came to claim the body or the estate. Or could I get the police records? Could I get the autopsy records? Nobody had asked for any of that stuff. But the thing about living here is that the truth is right in front of us. It's right there. If you want to know what's going on in the city and what's driving it and how the city's organized, you just have to push a little bit. Really. And the really surprising thing is not that we have a legacy of racist mayors. The really surprising thing is that so few of us have pushed those buttons.
So, Judith, what I found really fascinating is how you sort of followed a thread from natural disaster to, the crisis to sort of looking at disaster preparedness. Briefly, can you talk about sort of walking into, this con in Paducah, Kentucky, and sort of, seeing it all firsthand?
I found that all just so, I was awestruck because there's like the will, everybody's heart is really open. And basically if you said like, why are you here? They say, because we want to be prepared, because God forbid the big one happens, we're going to be there to help each other. And there's love everywhere. And there's this amazing infrastructure. And it's hyper local, but it's regional, and it's state, and it's national, and there's tons of money, and it's very organized, and everybody's very clear about what they need to do. And I just kept on thinking, like, well, what if we have this thing? It was like built after 9/11. It's built around the potential for terrorism. It's built around these natural disasters. But like, what if we just said, let's use the tabletop exercises and all of this infrastructure? And I know people do not want the National Guard coming into their community and fixing it. I get that. But I just could not get over how if we wanted to fix all the schools in a month, that I just think if we really wanted to like rebuild the schools and really refurbish them and make them beautiful in a month or 2 months, or in a fucking week, if we wanted to do that, we could do that because we know how to do that. But we just don't want to do that for anything that has to do with, eradicating racism, dealing with trying to address equity, looking in the face at the two different cities or the two different parts of this nation. And, so I just couldn't get over that. And I just kept on thinking like, wow, what if you just tweak this? What if you change the word? What if you change the law? And it was fun to poke at it. Mm-hmm. But I do think that it's actually quite possible. But I think that, I just like the idea that emergency was attached to that disaster was attached to that these are all words that they're words that we know and we understand in a certain way, but what if you just understood them in a different way? What if you looked at that as a disaster? What if you said, oh my gosh, they're dying every single day in much larger numbers, and we already know it. And that's the irony, is that all the people in there, they have all the stats. So they're like, wow, how many inhalers are we going to need for all the kids that have asthma? How much diabetes medication are we going to need to stockpile for people that are dealing with diabetes? Like, they're thinking about treatable diseases all the time, but they're stockpiling it. So that's why I went in that direction.
So what also kind of struck me is when you were interviewing one of the guys on the ground who talked about the big refrigerator trucks that could hold 27 bodies. I found that really, wow. There are no words. Why do you think that we sort of focus on the after effect instead of being sort of proactive when it comes to these sort of things?
Well, I'll take that and I'll just extend it. So last week, during the week, we had, what was the name of that panel? The City of Chicago and Cook County Today and Moving Forward. Yeah, the City of Chicago, Cook County Today, and moving forward. And so we had one of the commissioners of Cook County, actually one of the people who sponsored the resolution that was signed into effect today. And she said, oh my gosh, it's really true. It's exactly like that. So all the guys that are in charge of all of those trucks, they keep telling me, we want you to come on a tour. We get $26 million a year just for the county, just for Cook County, to work on disaster preparedness training. And so, but that's kind of like, it's not, I mean, on one level, it's like firm, it's for certain kinds of things. So there's grant money for certain kinds of things. And if the money is there, people want to spend it, of course. But at the same time, if someone said, wait a second, we've just declared extreme racism or structural racism, a public health crisis. And we understand exactly if the disaster hits where that's going to happen. Like that language now might give them a lot more leeway that commissioner and others to be able to say, maybe we could use last year's refrigerated Morgan wheels and let's take 20 of the $26 million and utilize it differently. Let's invest in the hyperlocal organizations or the libraries or the palaces for the people as we might define them, because we actually know that social cohesion and community infrastructure will save way more lives than another Morgan wheels. So I think that's what's really exciting, and I think that there is that possibility.
So, and the thing that you just said about sort of, organizations on the ground sort of figuring out on their own how to sort of save themselves. Can you sort of talk about that?
Actually, couldn't you, because you write about it?
This is true. And it's really funny because I just interviewed Danielle Perry from Growing Home, about a month ago.
She was here.
I heard. But it's really, like you said, really fascinating to see that how, I'm reminded of the guy, I can't remember his name, the army guy who said it was really a matter of, folks pulling up bootstraps. And to that effect, you kind of see people doing that, but without much help from the city or the county or or federal government. Can you talk about sort of like going back to the beginning of this, like what made you, sort of take on this project? Like what was the spark?
Well, I'd been working on a documentary film about climate change messengers, and we were following, a lot of them. Bill McKibben, Heidi Cullen. I mean, someone from the Weather Channel, this amazing author and thinker who went on to help be the founder of 350.org with his students from Middlebury College. We were following authors and, whistleblowers and all sorts of people, but there was no, and we were looking for stories of climate change and evidence of it in the United States. This was in 2002, and there really wasn't a great example of one in a city. And then this book was introduced to me, and there was a great example in a city, but this was such a bigger story. It really couldn't fit into that movie. It really deserved a movie of its own. But the thing that I was just amazed by was that one extreme weather event could reveal this underlying disaster and could help reveal the United States in a way that I certainly live in. I live in New York City. I live in a very segregated city. I grew up in one of the most segregated counties in the United States, Nassau County, Long Island, and I am totally a beneficiary of the redlining that my neighborhood was constructed around. But I never really saw it or understood it. A little bit when I read this book, but not until I really, took that tour of Inglewood in the way that I did.
There's something, a very powerful thing I realized when I was writing the Heatwave book, and I think it comes through even more vividly in the film than it does when I wrote it, which is that one of the things that's so powerful about these extreme events, these disasters, is they help to make visible things that are happening all the time, but that are very difficult to perceive. And they almost force a confrontation with it, right? And so when you asked everyone how they felt, there was a lot of anger, in the room. There is a lot of anger in the room. I think it's hard to watch that film and not be angry. And part of it is the kind of, the anger of living in Chicago and seeing the thing that it took me, a while to see. I didn't see it as a child here, but I saw it, as I got older. But then there's these these images like the ones from Katrina, and I was listening to everybody, watching that set of images, which we've seen before. There's not a single person sitting in the room tonight who hasn't seen those images of Katrina before, but, you put them in this context where it's not this kind of anomaly. It's actually Katrina is part of a pattern, right? And I remember you and, we were already working on the film, and I remember you telling me, it's, the fact that Katrina's happened now, I mean, it's so much clearer that the story is bigger than the heat wave. And now think about all the Katrinas we've had since Katrina. And there are more coming, right? And so I think it's so amazing that these disasters, they're like particle accelerators for a physicist, It's like they speed up things, the relationships that are there but hard to see, and they just make them visible. And suddenly you can see them. And the crazy thing about Chicago, and this is what I want everybody here to think about, because it's your city, I'll claim it too, is we had this confrontation. We had this radical expression of a thing that's always happening, was difficult to perceive, and our response was to put a snowflake on the cover. And and then the story's been, what the story is now when it gets really hot in Chicago has a heat emergency plan, right? And the brilliant Steve Whitman, and I just want to make sure we speak his name one more time, because Steve, I couldn't have written my book if it weren't for Steve Whitman and the things he did as a scholar and activist. And I don't know how he got appointed the chief epidemiologist in the city of Chicago, but I'm sure the Daley family regrets that decision. He's an amazing man. And when you ask him, what do you think of the heat emergency plan, and you can see his kind of incredibly expressive face get so uncomfortable, I think that's the thing. It's like Chicago has a heat emergency plan. When it gets really hot, you live here, you hear the radio, the television, the people asking, officials come and say, check on your neighbors. But the heat emergency plan that we have to deal with is much bigger than checking on your neighbors. And although I have come to think in this very funny way that if we really took seriously the idea of checking up on your neighbors, like what if we didn't just check up on our neighbors during the heat wave? What if the orientation that we had to living in a city and living together was to always check up on your neighbors, and not check up on like, hey, are you okay? Like on your mother's floor. But like what we were really concerned about is making sure that all of our neighbors were doing okay. And we weren't going to rest until we knew that everybody was doing okay. That would be a really different world. But we're very far from that right now.
I just came from San Francisco. I was there yesterday, and we showed the film at the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival a couple of times this week, and we will next week too. But the panel that we had an organization from the city and what they do in San Francisco. And heat waves are a really, really big problem actually in San Francisco, because this city was built to be cool, but it's getting hotter all the time. So there are pockets of communities that can become 85 degrees or 90 degrees, and that's enough because no one has air conditioning to actually start to kill people. And a number of those communities that have it the worst happen to be Black, a community called Bayview. But the city, they actually are funding block parties. Their whole commitment is to actually invest in community-based organizations and community institutions that build social cohesion, and they absolutely recognize that that's the best heat emergency plan. So, communities can fund, they can all compete to get money just to have a block party, because they know that you're kind of as safe as your block is organized, and they're building on top of that, and they're investing in community centers and the kinds of places that could become a cooling center, but it's going to be the best cooling center because it's actually addressing people's needs and community needs on a daily basis all of the time. So when they get that call to go there, they want to go. It's not the police station.
Actually making me think of another scene in your film that, is so powerful, which is that scene of the kids playing in the water on the street and the kind of arbitrary cruelty of the police officers coming to close the hydrant down. Now, there are health issues about, kids playing in the streets, and there's health issues about the water pressure being depleted. A lot of in the heat wave in 1995, so many hydrants got opened at the same time that there are a bunch of communities that lost water pressure. But we actually have technology now on the hydrants to spray safely, and it wasn't clear to me that they weren't doing that there. It seemed to me like the kids, I don't know, but there's something about that scene, that confrontation, that was incredibly powerful. During the heat wave, access to water on the streets and the block party was, that could make the difference between life and death for communities. And so there was places where the Tribune reported that there were water wars on the south and west sides of the city, because there were places where people were throwing, rocks and bottles at police officers. There was a report of a gunshot that was fired over water. And that's an amazing thing to know about our city.
So before we turn it over, I want to recognize someone who we're so lucky to have with us in the audience, and we were so lucky to get to spend time with her in the movie. And that's Sheila Muhammad, who was one of the founders of Fresh Moves and who was really one of the architects of that extraordinary idea. Are you here? Can you stand up? Do you want to turn it over?
Yeah, sure. So right now we'll be taking questions, comments from the audience. So feel free to come up.
Sign those postcards if you have to go. We know.
Please
it's late.
sign the postcards.
Fennell, there's a
please.
hand in the front row here.
Oh, and tell us your zip code.
Oh, snap. 60617. But how do you maintain consistent public accountability for something like that? Because, you can have films about several different topics that are relevant to the beneficial to society's development, but how do you refrain from that topic being drowned out by all the other things we need to address and the accountability of the people who watch it as you go and travel and share it with the world?
Well, I mean, what we've tried to do here for the last 2 weeks, which is really a model that we want to take with us, is to sort of utilize this public forum a little bit like a town hall, and bring, people that are actually doing important work on the ground, who are trying to address the life expectancy gap, or trying to build a local economy on the south and west sides of the city, and who are committed to doing that, and who are pushing the city to actually fund local solutions at the local level. So, I mean, I don't know if that's one of the important things we want to do with the movie is to certainly get everybody agitated and thinking and angry, and then we want to be able to make sure that we could offer folks the opportunity to be able to, the postcard's one little piece of it. That's just like one little thing that we could do right now. Ultimately, we hope that we could take everybody's interest and will and funnel it into addressing the inequity. That's a big, huge problem, but doing it in a way that's supportive of on-the-ground movements here in the city, whether it's through the public health advocacy work and the work that's going on, like with West Side United, or whether it's supporting the local organizations that are really on the ground in Inglewood, or working or supporting the environmental justice groups like Viejo. I don't know if that answers your question, but not really. Do you want to?
Well, so as we're talking, I think New York is sort of recovering from a major flash flood, and so yeah, there have been shots of people sort of wading through water in Brooklyn.
From a few days ago, from Monday, I think.
I've been away. I'm sorry.
It's okay. But the thing is that New York has a pretty progressive mayor in Mayor de Blasio, and people are still sort of finding resistance and getting the resources necessary to help their communities. So, I think she brings up a very important point to me. Now that we have someone that might be considered more progressive than, say, Rahm Emanuel, how does this change? How do we continue to, keep people...
Keep it going,
yeah.
as opposed to it being something that stops with the people who are interested in it. Because that's where a lot of things find bounds. But it's something that you need everybody to participate in order for it to develop.
Yeah, look, so, I think of the writing that I do on this and the speaking I do, and I think of this film as a kind of, it's an expression and a story, but it's also an invitation. I think hopefully this issue is an invitation for people to think about the city and this issue in a different way. And, so I think our hope is that, you find yourselves engaged and interested enough and upset about this, enough that you want to do something. And the doing something could start with, telling your friends about this incredible film you saw, or a story about Chicago. It's like I go around and talk about the heat wave of 1995, and it's amazing nobody has heard of the Great Chicago Heat Wave. Is when you leave a few places, around Chicago, and nobody knows about this story still. But there are other stories like it that we need to tell. And then I think there's questions about what is it that we ask for? What do we demand? So we're talking about building schools and how we could build schools. So I have students at NYU who are really interested in the Green New Deal, and they think look, the world that we're living in right now, the world we're building is not a world where young people are really going to have much of a future. They have far fewer opportunities to have, healthy, successful lives. And so, how could we do something that would rebuild infrastructure and get people jobs and create better housing? And, I have a student who's now a professor at Penn, and he's figured out that how much it would cost to build, 10 million public housing units that are very well designed, that support communities, not that could be well taken care of around the country. 10 million units. It would cost about the same amount of money that we spend every year giving back lots of tax money to very wealthy people, because the tax cuts that we just passed, that took all that's what it is. A year of tax cuts would pay for 10 million housing units around the country. We made a political decision to do that. And I think a lot of Americans, are like, oh, well, I could be rich someday. I guess I can get behind a tax cut. And I think that's a horrible thing. So, we should be screaming in the streets about the tax cut, and we should be organizing and doing everything possible to make sure that we have a really dramatic change in our political priorities, and soon. And the crazy thing about being alive right now is that, and you guys can tell me if you disagree with me, but I can see a scenario where we're all sitting here in 4 years from now, and we are shuddering because we have an authoritarian government and democracy is being shut down, and we don't know what our future is going to be. And I could also see us sitting here in 4 years being like, oh my God, I can't believe that we're actually getting this Green New Deal and this amazing thing is happening. I mean, I don't know where we're heading. I don't think anybody in this room knows where we're heading. Something incredibly terrifying could happen very, very soon, but also something completely amazing could happen. And your question is a big question, because it's asking, what are we all going to do in this room in the very near future to get the better outcome?
But one of the answers that we've heard this whole week over and over is listen to the people who are on the ground. They really understand. There's extraordinary Renaissance thinkers on the South Side, in Inglewood, Rage, Grow Greater Inglewood. Name some more.
But for now, saying we have to stop talking because people on the ground have questions.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Can I say one thing?
Please.
In answer to that question. So we told you about this resolution today. I think all of you need to figure out who your county commissioner is. I didn't know until today. And we need to hold their feet to the fire on this resolution. I mean, right now it's just words, but let's see what their action turns into. I think, call them out, call them up, say, what are you doing, to make racism, to address racism as a public health crisis? That's
I mean,
my 2
they're
cents.
committing a lot of money and a new office on equity. And what was the name of the new office that they want to create?
let's get
get
some more
going.
questions.
More
Let's-
questions.
Yeah, so I've been living in 60622 in Westtown for the past 10 years. I'm also on the West Side United's Community Advisory Council. And I love what you had to say about the looking at FEMA and kind of looking at redistributing kind of the urgency and the emergency crisis. But I'm wondering how, in addition to FEMA, what are the other agencies that you could target to redistribute the funding in addition to kind of emergency preparedness at the federal, state, local level?
Some people point to HUD. I don't know. I bet there's other people who know this. I'm sure you know this.
Well, I mean,
I don't know that. I don't know. This is
so Homeland Security is a massive agency. Pentagon is getting the lion's share of public resources for things like this. I think like sometimes we talk about what's happened in kind of recent history as neoliberalism, right? The idea we've shrunk the state and the state doesn't do as much. We want big market, little state. But the truth is that we haven't actually shrunk the state that much. What we've done is we've shrunk the redistributive side of the state, that provides public goods and improves the quality of life for most of us. And we've substantially beefed up the military and paramilitary sides of the state, right? From DHS and ICE to mass incarceration and big police departments. And we have made and so it's a scandal that we are feeding the Pentagon in the way that we are. It's a scandal that we're talking about, ICE and the border and this security in the way that we do, given that immigration actually makes the United States safer. you know. And so what I think the deep question here is, you know, how do we get that redistribution back in the other direction? And that's what this book I wrote recently called Palaces for the People is really about, this idea of like, how do we revive the idea of the public good, which, you know, was once a really driving part of American society. This idea that, you know, we want to live in a society where more people, everyone really has an opportunity to make something more of their lives, where everyone has a decent chance, where we invest in things like libraries and public schools and parks and public health.
But that's socialism. I'm kidding. I just,
And that's
But that was us. That was American. That was the United States. Not all that long ago. And so something really
An emergency plan.
something really dramatic has happened. And I think that what you're asking about is how do we shift it back in the other direction? I would answer that the same way I did before. You know, we're in a crucial switching point in our history. Like this period right now, we're going to look back on this period of the next 12 months or 14 months, whatever it is, 15 months. This is it. Like there's going to be more fights after this, but this 15-month period that we're about to head into could not be more important, right? And so we all have to be thinking about what we're going to do.
But you know what's interesting, because the kind of organizing that has to happen in order to us to figure out what to do and to vote in the right way is the human emergency plan that builds the social cohesion and the block by block safety and security. And the institutions that you're talking about, those are the cooling centers.
Yeah. All right, let's take another question.
I just wanted to share that one of the aspects of the film that really struck me was the reactions from some of the white city officials and different individuals from the different vignettes that ranged from kind of a willful ignorance of these issues to just befuddled or bewildered to kind of being combative from, Mayor Daley, those video clips and stuff like that. And that felt really familiar to me because I exist within a larger family system where we have differing political viewpoints. And it can be really challenging around, the Thanksgiving table and things like that when I try to bring up issues like this. And I think unfortunately, a film like this, there's kind of a selection bias in who chooses to see it. And my husband and I were just reflecting like, oh gosh, we have certain family members that like, oh, if we could just get them to sit down and watch this movie, maybe they would start to understand. And I was just wondering if, in terms of thinking about bigger picture, longer term solutions to some of these racial inequalities, how do we bring more people into the fold without, and how do we do that with, if anyone's thought about that, with, keeping our families intact? And I want to be able to sway people and have them watch a film like this, but it feels difficult to impossible sometimes.
One of the reasons I wound up putting myself in it, it was not my idea in the beginning, and I wasn't going to do that. And then at a certain point, it was like I couldn't make all the characters connect all the dots, so I did. But I think it's useful having a white person lead other white people to go on this journey. So I'm hoping that that's useful. Maybe that wouldn't be so useful in your family, but I don't have a better answer for that. Listen, tell them, hey, I saw this movie. I learned something about the city I didn't know. Watch it with me. It'll be on public television 2020.
We have a question right here.
That's the first I've ever heard about 1940 FHA. Do you know, have there been any redress for that whatsoever by the federal government or systemically? And do you know, are there any ideas of how to redress that?
There have been no systematic redresses for what was, systematic segregation of the United States, and the idea is called reparations. And some people take it seriously. And you could very much see a scenario in which reparations became part of a real national policy push to try to deal with this, blatant, core fundamental shaping, feature of American society. Power of racial discrimination from slavery through unfair housing and segregation. So there's a great book that won a lot of prizes a couple years ago, if it's not a story called The Color of Law, by I think Richard Rothstein, which is a kind of legal history of the production of segregation told as a narrative, and it's incredibly powerful. There's been a lot written about the making of a segregated Chicago, including a great book called The Making of the Second Ghetto, by Arnold Hirsch, a late historian, which has a lot to say about how Chicago got as segregated as it is. It's a story that everyone in the United States should know, that everyone in this city should know. You can't understand why the city looks the way it does if you don't understand redlining, and the only real way to deal with the implications of it, because it's not just about where people live now, it's about a whole legacy of who was able to accumulate wealth, and who was not, and who was able to get access to good schools and who was not, is to deal with reparations. That's probably not going to help at your family Thanksgiving when you bring up that topic. But I want to say also, I really appreciate that question about how you deal with this, because what we don't want to be doing is just kind of preaching to the choir. And there's a danger in these conversations, which is that, we make art and we write books and we give lectures to people who already agree with us. And that's not going to get us where we need to go. And so I spend a lot of time, in my work trying to think about stories that I can tell and ways of communicating with people who don't share all of my priors. And I try to go to places where not everyone will agree with me, and tell stories. The reason I've been writing a lot about libraries recently as a kind of a great case of a public good is because you go to every red state in this country, and you could find incredible enthusiasm for the library as an institution. People in red states use libraries. Public athletic fields and things like that. They're very popular, and so I feel like we have to start to build. We have to find our common ground, figure out where we share, some core values, and I think build up from there. And sometimes that means building relationships, in areas that it doesn't start with politics. You don't lead the conversation always with strangers with, what did you think of that last Trump tweet? That's not going to go very well. You don't start the conversation on Twitter. Seek out some common ground and build up. And I think of that, when I think about the work that we need to do to get somewhere, I think that's really crucial. That kind of work is to start to seek that. And there's going to be some people who are not going to be open to the message. I can think of people in my world where it's it's just not worth going there. But I think there are a lot of people who, could be open to learning and understanding. And if we can't start to work there, I don't think we have much of a chance.
And that's why I chose disaster preparedness and the emergency paradigm, because HUD doesn't do it in the same way. Because if, let's just say, all of the grassroots organizers who are doing this amazing social cohesion work really said, you know what, I'm a new brand of first responder. I want to start going to disaster preparedness meetings. I want to go to Kentucky. I want to go to those regional meetings. I'm worried about the big one too. And guess what? I know exactly the kind of resilience that my community needs. I know I have done the asset mapping. I understand it all. They would be they would be the greatest asset at the table, and they would have to be taken seriously. I truly believe that. And the disaster preparedness world actually has this, they have language for it. It's called whole of community and all of this stuff. So when you take on that new frame, you actually get to sit at a table with people who you might never have sat with before. And you're sort of talking the same language because essentially everybody does care. So I think it's a radical reframe that can actually bring people together around something that is different than saying, let's deal with structural racism and I want to deal with it and I'm pissed off at you. You could still feel all that stuff, but you're talking about disaster preparedness, which is just a language that everybody can kind of agree on. It's a little gentle.
I guess I've got the next question. Could you address class in this society and the way it's built on the racist structures that are mentioned in the film, and that people can't seem to get beyond. There's no profit in helping poor people be less poor or being independent of an economic system that requires certain behaviors. It's called capitalism in this country, where the word wage slave is well known in the city of Chicago, goes back to its history of the struggles over decent working conditions back in the Haymarket area, etc. Could you address that and the fact that the class leadership in this country, the people who hang out at the Council on Foreign Relations, have decided that it's in their interest to let the planet burn, let us all cook, thinking that they'll somehow have the means to survive. And then I'd like to give you something afterwards.
Okay, so, I mean, I think you kind of made the point. I didn't. There wasn't really. There wasn't so much of a question as to, I guess you're asking if I agree with you about that. I mean, class is a huge feature of this story. And I think it's all over the film as well. I mean, this is not just a story about race. It's also a story about poverty. And poverty is not just an accident that happens. Poverty is produced. And then not only is poverty produced by a system, but then poverty is either addressed or allowed to do what it's doing. And I think part of what I'm talking about when I describe the shift from a more of a redistributive state that makes a commitment to public goods and to creating opportunities to a state that's punitive and that's focused on defense and militarism and to the production of extreme wealth is a shift in a state that's in a way been captured by the most affluent classes around. Is that just a part of the story of climate change? Yeah, capitalism has been really bad for the climate, growth. The kind of growth that we have is unsustainable. I don't think it explains everything. I think there's a lot of parts of the story that are explained by other things. Like it actually is a feature of this event that the structure of certain neighborhoods varies tremendously in Chicago. And you didn't get into this much in the book, but I've written a lot about one of the really puzzling features of the heat wave, which is that while it's certainly true that the geography of mortality followed the lines of racial segregation and poverty, it's also stunningly the case that there are a number of very segregated, very poor African American neighborhoods in Chicago that did better in the heat wave than the North Side. Because of the structure of the neighborhood and because of the nature of the kind of street life and social infrastructure, and so there, so a thing, and there's also, one of the very weird things that happened in the last election in this country is that a lot of the kind of traditional elites in the United States that would have lined up behind a Republican shifted and couldn't support Trump, and maybe they saw it as destructive to their long-term interests and the sustainability of the system, but I guess I'm trying to say we're living in an interesting time. And I think because of that, it's important for us to name these inequalities. It's important for us to name the drivers of a system that is producing inequality and exploitation. You're onto something for sure. But I think it's also important for us to note that this is a moment where people are changing allegiances and interested in finding new models. And I think that there are a lot of people who had very firm positions on what was right and wrong who are now open to doing things differently. So I would just ask, so to you, I would say, I hear what you're saying, and I would also ask you to think about, what's a language that you can use that will be as inviting as possible to people who you want to be on board with your project. The guy sitting next to you agrees with me 100% on this. I don't know if anybody else does, but how are we doing?
I think we have
two more questions. Let's take the questions back to back, and then we can kind of treat them all.
Okay. Hi, my name's Colette. Thank you so much. This was absolutely beautiful and extremely important for the city. So I'm a documentary filmmaker, so this was also very inspiring to see how much impact you can create just by this film. So this is very beautiful just to see. I wanted to ask more about the filmmaking side of things and about production, how long you took to make this film, and then also if you've shown it to the people that, if you got any backlash from the authority figures and that sort of thing as well.
Well, let's do another question.
What's the other question?
I have a question. 60649. And one of the things that resonated with me, Dr. Linda Murray had mentioned that she was angered and outraged, but not surprised. One of the things in the film you brought about the Chicago heat death map. And then when you saw that when you overlaid it with things like the poor outcomes on cardiovascular disease, diabetes, breast cancer, that it mirrored the same things. So I was wondering, again, outraged, angered, and not surprised. Any idea if people are getting together to address that? I mean, all these different areas.
Well, in terms of the second question, the gentleman from West Side United could please, if in a few words, please tell us what you're doing to try to address the life expectancy gap, which is about 30 years difference between one side of town and the other. Oh. Okay.
Well, I think I can kind of answer this. So I've been sort of covering Inglewood for the last 7 months, and what I'm seeing are a lot of organizations sort of offering wraparound services. They understand that like it's not just one thing, so they're taking sort of a holistic approach to things. So like you'll say, for instance, like I wrote about a church having a street fair, and in that street fair you'll have music, you'll have back to school stuff, and then you'll have like say like a local clinic coming to offer free vaccinations and health screenings and stuff like that. So you're seeing a lot of that in Inglewood and other parts of the city. And I think again it's a matter of folks sort of taking things into their own hands, not really just sort of waiting for or relying on city and local, support to come through, because they understand. I mean, like when Dr. Murray said she wasn't surprised, that's sort of the POV of a lot of Black folks in the city. Like you're angered, you're shocked, but you're not surprised. And we've heard the bootstraps BS our entire lives, and we sort of we take that and we sort of do it for ourselves, and we're sort of used to that. So.
Got a question about the making of the film.
It took a long time. So we started in 2003. This was not my only full-time job. It would have been wonderful if it was. It would have been done a lot sooner. But it took many, many, many years and many iterations and a tremendous amount of editing and going down sort of in one direction, and maybe a lot of that material sort of didn't get in and going in another direction. But, as the years went by, it became clearer and clearer, especially with more and more disasters. After Katrina, there was Sandy. After Sandy, there was Maria. This trend, we sort of started to understand it in a very clear way. But Dr. Whitman was an absolute core and key thread, and him being, that map that he pointed to, that was so pivotal then, it really became sort of pivotal, both when we went back in time and when we went forward, and sort of keeping health disparity and inequity sort of as a core thread that we were looking at. That became very, very clear. So, and in terms of, the question was about the responses from people who are somewhat, no, we haven't. I mean, the general isn't that general anymore. He unfortunately lost his job, or fortunately, I'm not sure. So he's not sort of where he was. We haven't quite found him yet, so he hasn't seen it.
I tried very hard right before this run. I told Judith we needed to save a seat, like the seat in the middle on the row that's elevated, like right in the center, and just put a sign for Mayor Daley there and keep it open until Mayor Daley showed up at the screening. But you didn't like that idea very much. So.
The thing is, I think it's more important that Mayor Lightfoot sees the movie and wants to run with it than to have Mayor Daley look at it. And what's he gonna do?
I won't argue with that. Can we get it to her?
We are well. She definitely knows about it. She's quoted the movie a little bit. I think your sister knows how to get it to her.
No, just a quick fact that when she took office, the art piece that she put behind her desk is a piece by Amanda Williams, a Chicago artist, with a map of the redlining, and I can get it to her.
Excellent. So,
All right, mission accomplished. We can all go home. Thank you very much, everybody.
I mean, there's like we packed these panels with people that are deeply connected to her and are working with her or are part of her transition team. And there are people who've been like tweeting to her and sending her notes and saying, you got to see this movie. And right when the heat wave started last week, apparently she was quoted on the radio as saying, I've read the reports and I know there's a movie out there. I'm going to see the movie. We're working very hard at addressing the heat. So anyway.
Can I just say before we end this, as someone who grew up in Chicago and who still feels very identified with the city, I know that you're a native New Yorker and you still live there, but I think you have earned the title of honorary Chicagoan because of this. And I'd like to ask you right now in front of all these people to tell us what's better, thin slice or deep dish pizza?
Oh, God, no, please.
Thin.
All right.
Taking the key to the city away now.
I like that. Say it again.
Best film about Chicago by a non-Chicagoan ever, having sat through many. That's true.
That's a good question.
Wow.
That's a really good question.
One of the reasons why that might be the case is because Fennell was a producer and she's from Chicago, and we made it in concert and in deep collaboration with Cartemquin. And the hope was that, the hope was that this might be a story about Chicago, but this is a story about every city in the United States. And the offering, what the heat wave offered was a primer for how all of us could be prepared for the future by really dealing with the past. And none of us have done it. So that map was the primer for how to deal with the future heat crisis and the past crisis, the disaster and the long-term impact of segregation. That's what Dr. Whitman was offering all of us. And that should have been on the cover of that report. So, this is our goal in taking this to other cities, is when the lights come up, people say, what is our story? What is our map? What is the slow motion public health disaster going on within a 5-mile radius of where I live? Who are the new brand of first responders who are addressing this at a deep community level, and how can I support them? So, and will my city join Chicago and Milwaukee and declare racism a public health crisis and actually do something about it? And can I get that $26 million and invest it radically differently? So that's what we're trying to do. So it's good that I'm not from here, because we're taking it outside of here too. But yes, in the back. Yes, you're waving. And then that's it.
Can we get the map? Like, are there copies of the map that are available, like, online or PDF?
Which map?
The maps, the death map itself.
Oh, the heat, death, poverty, all the maps?
Yeah.
That's so interesting that you asked that. We wanted to create some kind of an app, a map app, so that you'd have them and it could be useful, and on it would be plotted the new brand of first responders, so you could see the network of social cohesion that exists and support it. We don't have that, but Fennell, how do we get them the maps?
Those maps are really easy to find. In fact, the city of Chicago actually has open data, which is really easy to search. So if you just go to cityofchicago.gov, you can. It takes a little bit of digging, but you can find maps.
And we have a website. It's called cookthefilm.com. If any of you think that you know of an institution here in this city, a community organization, the people who need to see this movie, we'd be very interested in hearing about that. And you have your hand up. You said you have something you need to say.
Yes, it's just two quick statements. The
Could you hold on one
We're
second? I
gonna
think we're
give
going to
you a
get you a mic.
microphone. You're taking us out, by the way. No pressure.
It's not a good takeout.
Uh-oh.
But anyway, the criteria for a heat wave is 3 days and 90 degrees or something like that. Does it have to be 3 days or less for to be considered a heat wave?
I mean, I think there actually is no official criteria.
I think it is.
What I've heard is 3
One
days,
day can't be a heat wave.
3 days that it doesn't get below 80 degrees at night. That's my
I
understanding.
think, unfortunately, I think one of the problems we have is there's kind of varying criteria. So maybe that's what Chicago uses. But
They need to nail that down. But I had one more statement for you, sir. Since you mentioned libraries, I just been wanting to know, do they still make encyclopedias?
I can't say if they're still producing. I believe someone's still printing encyclopedias, and I'm sure you can get lots of things that are encyclopedic online. So thank you for that. But I don't want to go out on that. No offense, sir. He did say it was bad. He acknowledged it was bad. I want to go. I guess. I mean, I kind of like going out on. This is the best film ever made about Chicago by a non-Chicagoan, which was good.
That, yeah.
But I'll go out another way, which is to say, look, I think I want to, one last time, congratulate and thank you and Fennell and all the people who worked on this film, either as producers of the film, as voices in the film, or as participants in the conversations. And one of the things that I think is really important and that I learned from you in this process is that the work doesn't end when you put the work out into the world, which I think is how kind of a lot of people in my world treat the work that we do. You write something, you publish it, it goes, and you see what happens. In a way, the work, a whole different kind of work begins when there's something that's out there that you can share. And I really respect the way that you have brought so many different people and groups into conversations here in Chicago over the last few weeks. It's special. It's something I think very few filmmakers do, that you have a young child and you've dedicated yourself to telling the story and to engaging people and to issuing this invitation for people to do something about it. And, it's a remarkable thing that tonight, the end of a 2-week run in Chicago on a gorgeous summer night, this is a sold-out room. And only half of you guys are my family members, and
Less than half.
And it's I think what you've done is really important, and I really do thank you, and and I thank all of you for coming here, and I truly hope these things I've been trying to say tonight about how important this period of time is. I really hope that some of you in the room will take up that challenge, because there's a tremendous amount of work to do, and watching the film. Helps us recognize why that's so important. But what really matters is not what we say together tonight. It's what happens after we leave here.
Right. Right. So yeah, the last lines of the movie is, what kind of world do we want to live in? So, we do have a choice. I mean, a lot of choice has been removed, and for some people, lots of choice has been removed, but we do have a choice. And I would love to, you have the last word, and I want to make sure everyone knows how to read what you're doing, so they could, because that is one way for us to understand who the Renaissance thinkers are on the south and west sides of the city.
So for those who don't know, Black Club Chicago is a nonprofit newsroom, and we sort of focus on hyper-local reporting. So our idea, we're embedded in these communities. We sometimes live in them, and we sort of eat, sleep, breathe these neighborhoods. I don't know what else to add to that. I think the work we do is important. Feel free to check out our site, www.blockclubchicago.org. I'm sorry, I've had very little sleep. And please, by all means, support us, because that's, we're making sure that the news comes to you. And I think that's kind of, reason enough to check it out.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you outside. Sign those postcards.